everyone, sir and peers. Welcome to group 2. Now we are gonna learn about two chapters, chapter 3 and 4. Chapter 3 itself will discuss about behavioral concepts from psychology and social psychology, and chapter 4 is about historical perspective. But before we jump into the material, let me introduce the member of this group. We have three members, consists of me, Rizkawati, and two my friends, Tessa Laurencia and Takiyudin Amri. For me, in this video, I'm gonna explain to you about attitudes and motivation. We directly jump into the attitudes and motivation learning. We already known from the previous group in the last weeks mentioned to us they are complex factors might be influence to people behavior. It might like personal need and motivation, group pressure, organization demands, personal historical and stuff and so on. The factors might be clustered into three categories. The first is character structure, the second is social structure, and then the last group dynamic. For the attitude and motivation, it include in the character structure and social structure. Objective about attitudes. Attitudes are learned tendency to react in a constantly favorable or unfavorable manner towards people, object, ideas, and situations. The attitudes objects is to use to incorporate all the objects which person might be react. The example may be like a real person, an abstract person, a company, police, an abstract concept, or a group, a social group. Attitude is a tendency or a predisposition to respond, not the response itself. So attitudes are not behavior, rather they are represents a readiness to action or behavior. And attitudes are learned, well established, and difficult to change. People acquire attitudes from personal experience, parents, peers, and social groups. There are three components included in the attitudes. The first is cognitive, the second is emotional, and then the last is behavioral components. For the cognitive itself, it made up of the idea, perceptions, and belief one has about the attitude's object. It also refers to the information one has about the attitude object and to the stereotype or generalization one might make. And for the emotional or affective components refers to the feelings one has toward the attitude object. It is my positive and negative feelings. For the positive, include liking, respect, or empathy. For the negative feelings, include dislike, fear, or disgust. For the last components is behavioral components. The behavioral components refers to how one might react to the attitude object. Discuss more about the component, here there are 4 points that we have to consider. It is belief, opinion, values, and habits. For the belief and opinions, it is concluded in the cognitive components. I'll explain one by one. Broadly, belief may be defined as the cognitive component of an attitude. Belief may be based on sound scientific evidence, on prejudice, or on intuitions, while opinions are sometimes defined as a synonym for both attitudes and belief. Like belief, opinions are also associated with the cognitive component of attitude and are not concerned with how people judge or evaluate an object. But here, opinions are viewed as narrow concept than attitudes. To the third point, it is values. Values are important life goal and behavior standard. They are the deep-seated goals and basic sentiments by which people oriented themselves toward higher goal and by which they differentiate what worthwhile and beautiful from the sordid and proven. The last point is habit, are unconscious, automatic, and repeated pattern of behavioral response. Alright, next, after we know what is attitude, components, and the point, now we have to know what is the function actually of the attitudes. Here I deserve four functions of the attitudes. The first is understanding, the second is need satisfaction, the third ego defense, and the last value expression. Understanding. The understanding or knowledge function helps a person give meaning to or make sense out of the new situation or events. For the new satisfactions, people tend to form positive attitudes toward objects that meet their needs and negative attitudes toward objects that toward their needs. The third, ego defense. Attitudes serve an ego defensive function by developing or changing to protect people from acknowledging basic truth or about themselves or the world. And the last, fellow expressions. This function, people gain satisfaction by expressing themselves through their attitudes. Attitudes may be tell the world who a person is and for what a person stands. Alright, now we're gonna learn about attitude formation and change. Attitude formation refers to developing an attitude towards an object when none existed previously. Attitude change refers to substituting a new attitude for one that was held previously. Attitudes are formed on the basis of psychological, personal, and social factors. The most fundamental way in which attitudes are formed is through the direct personal experience. Okay, now we want to study about the story of attitude change. In this slide, you can see there are four theories. The first is stimulus response and reinforcement theories. These theories focus on how people respond to a particular stimuli. Responses are likely to be repeated if they are rewarded or reinforced. The second, social judgment theory. This theory considers attitudes change as resulting from a change in how people perceive an object rather than a change in belief about the object. The third theory is consistency and dissonance theories. This theory holds the relationship between attitudes and behavior is in a balance when there is no cognitive stress in the system. The last is self-perception theories. It holds that people develop attitudes based on how they observe and interpret their own behavior. Attitude will be changed only after behavior change. Okay, now let's move to the next material. It is about motivation. Motivation. Motivation is the key to initiative, driving, sustaining, and directing behavior. It is important concept for behavioral content because organizational effectiveness depending on people performing as they are expected to perform. Also, a motive is a single factor that sparks the motivation process. Moving on now about motivation theories. You can see in this slide divided into two motivation theories, need theories and expectancy theories. Need theories based on Maslow need hierarchy, the ERG concept, Heisenberg two factors theory. For the Maslow need hierarchy, the theory holds that people are motivated by their desire to satisfy a hierarchically ordered set of needs, basic physiological needs, uh, safety needs, social and belonging needs, esteem needs, power, and self-actualization needs. Maslow need theory is important for managers and behavioral accountants to know because it does focus attention on individual needs and recognize that the same incentive may not satisfy everybody's needs. Next to the ERG concept, it processes three need categories: existency, readiness, and growth. In that three are not necessarily higher and lower order needs, and that even though a need may have been satisfied, the same need may still remain the dominant motivator. And then the last is Heisenberg two factors theory focus on two sets of reward that result from work, those related to job satisfaction like motivation and those related to job dissatisfaction like hygiene factors. Okay, the second motivation theory is expectancy theory. From the title, we already know this is based on the expectancy. In the sentence, the expectancy theory of motivation assumes that the level of motivation to perform a task depends on the belief one that has the reward structure for the task. Motivation exists when a person expects to receive a particular reward for performing a particular task. So this is the theory said that the motivation is the product of expectancy, instrumentally, and valency. Maybe that's all from me, and now we'll continue by my friend.
Hello everyone, I'm Tessa Laurencia. Right now, I'm going to explain what is perception, learning, and personality. Let's first of all take a look in what is perception. So, the formal definition of perception is the process by which we select, organize, and interpret stimuli into a meaningful and coherent picture of the world. But in the simple word, perception is how people see or interpret events, objects, and people. People act on the basis of their perception, regardless of whether those perceptions accurately or inaccurately reflect reality. In fact, reality is what each person perceives it to be. One person's description of reality may be far from another person's description. Move on to the next slide, the perception for behavioral accountants. So, managers and behavioral accountants must develop a accurate perception of the people with whom they deal. The difference that they perceive between key groups of people may account for successful or unsuccessful operation. An incorrect perception of individual differences may be result in the wrong person being assigned to a critical task. Behavioral accountants need to know about perception because the perception that people form develop into the ideas and attitude that influence behavior. For example, if a potential employee perceives a company promotion and compensation policy as fair, that person is likely to join the firm and become a satisfied worker. Otherwise, if the policies are perceived as unfair, the prospective employee will join some other firm or be less than totally productive worker. Some application of perception are discussed below in the next slide. Physical stimuli versus individual predisposition. People experience the world differently because perception depends on both physical stimuli and individual predisposition. What is physical stimuli? Physical stimuli are raw sensory input such as sight, sound, and touch. Individual predispositions include motive, needs, attitude, past learning, and expectation. Perception differ among people because individual sensory receptors may function differently, but primarily because predisposition differ. Individual predisposition. Four other factors associated with individual predisposition are familiarity, feeling, importance, emotion. Familiarity is a people generally perceive a familiar object faster than unfamiliar objects or people. For example, if we know that a student is from Harvard University, our familiarity with that university may result in a quick perception of the student. But if the student is known to be a student of ABC University, our lack familiarity with this university will result in a slower development of perception. Second, feeling. People feeling toward an object or person also affect perception. There is a tendency for people to seek more information about object toward which they hold strong positive or negative feelings. Third, importance. Similarly, the more important a person or object is, the more information is sought. In both cases, the more information available about an object, the more complete the perception of the object. Fourth, emotion. A person's emotional state can affect perception. Perception may differ depending on whether we are having a good day or bad day, whether we feel happy or stressed, and so on. Selection, organization, and interpretation of stimuli. As mentioned above, perception is the process by which we select, organize, and interpret stimuli. We are only able to perceive a small portion of all the stimuli to which we are exposed. Thus, consciously or unconsciously, we select what we perceive. Usually, we select for perception those things that we find most interesting and important. We see what we expect to see and are motivated to achieve what we need or want. For example, depending on our needs or expectation, we may see only the good or bad in a particular situation. Next slide. People organize stimuli into groups and perceive it as a unified whole. If given incomplete information, people will fill in the gaps and then behave as thought they had complete information about the situation. Perceptual interpretation depends on past experience and social group membership. When stimuli are ambiguous, for example, people will interpret them in a manner that is consistent with their needs, interests, and attitude. Perceptions are distorted by accepting stereotypes and logical error. What is stereotype? Stereotype is when we generalize belief about a particular category of things or people. We believe in information retrieved from respective sources, relying on first impression and jumping into conclusion directly. What is logical error? It is whereby an initial impression about a person is formed based on only one known characteristic. For example, if a person is known to hold a responsible position, such as doctor, that individual also may be perceived to be a reliable person and trustworthy. This perception, however, may be inaccurate. When they don't accurate, our perception may be distorted. Related to logical error in perception is the halo effect, whereby we generalize from one set of qualities to a non-relevant set of qualities. For example, accountants that spend their time to make financial statements for a company may be perceived as reserved person and a perfectionist, when in fact they may possess none of these qualities. Perceptual defense arises because people don't want to be proven wrong in their perception. Thus, people may ignore, overlook, or distort information that calls existing perception into question. Relevance of perception for accountants. Behavioral accountants can apply knowledge of perception to many organizational activities. For example, in performance evaluation, the manner in which a person is appraised may be affected by the accuracy of the supervisor perception. Incorrect or biased rating may result in good performance becoming discorrect and dissatisfied, and they may leave the firm. Therefore, supervisors should recognize that their feelings about certain subordinates may affect their evaluation and should be on guard against this sort of bias. Frequently, differential perception are the cause of communication problem in an organization. The sender may perceive the message one way, and the receiver perceive it another way based on their frame of reference. For example, when a manager may instruct the supervisor to delete the file they discussed yesterday, but they discussed two files, the manager may be referring to one file and the supervisor to the other. This misperception may also lead to strained interpersonal relations at work. Fourth, we're gonna to discuss about learning. Learning is the process by which new behaviors are acquired. It occurs as the result of motivation, experience, and repetition in response to particular stimuli or situation. This combination of motivation, experience, and repetition occurs in two forms: called as classical conditioning and operand conditioning. So about classical conditioning, this theory is discovered by Russian physiologist Ivan Pavlov. Classical conditioning is a type of unconscious or automatic learning. This learning process creates a conditioned response through association between an unconditioned stimulus and a natural stimulus. Pavlov observed that dogs would salivate not only when food was placed in their mouth, but also when they observe food. The food is an unconditioned stimulus that causes a reflex behavior to occur. This behavior is called unconditioned stimulus. Unconditioned behavior are not learned. In his experiment, Pavlov first rang a bell, then fed the dog. At first, the dog only salivated when the food was presented, but after repeated treatments, the dog eventually salivated at the sound of the bell. You can see the illustration in the picture here on the screen. In this case, the bell or stimulus was followed by a conditioned response. Conditioned response are learned. The relationship between a stimulus and a conditioned response is called as classical conditioning. Move on to operand conditioning. Operand conditioning is the case whereby behaviors that people freely choose to perform increase or decrease in frequency depending on whether they are followed by reinforcement or punishment. In classical conditioning, a natural stimulus is followed by a reward or punishment, which produce a response. In operant conditioning, the response brings on the reward or punishment. For example, the example for reinforcement, which increase a behavior, is when we command a dog with the stimulus second, a dog will respond by extending its paw because it has learned that this response will bring on reward. And the example of punishment is when in a company there's an employee that coming late, then the company make a policy that they will give a punishment to the employee to minimize the tardiness in the company. There is a form or example of punishment. Now we are going to discuss about what is personality. Personality refers to the inner psychological characteristic, example, traits, qualities, and mannerism that determine and reflect how a person responds to his or her environment. Personality is the essence of individual difference. No two people are alike in terms of personality, but they may be similar in terms of particular personality characteristic. The concept of personality and knowledge of its components are important because they enable us to predict behavior. For example, an introverted person is likely to be withdrawn and shy. But personality, however, can change. A major life event, for instance, can cause a change in personality. Behavioral accountants can deal effectively with people if they understand how personality develops and how it can change. The main application of personality theory in organization is in predicting behavior. That's all the explanation about learning, perception, and personality.
Alright guys, I will continue for number 6, that is the feudalism and capitalism. So the first is the feudal system. Feudalism is the socio-economic order that was defined by a series of social relations based on status derived from lineage and age. That is, in medieval Europe, a man was a serf or a lord, a merchant or a guild member, and his position in the social structure depended on the family into which he was born rather than on merit. And next is, the land and labor were not object of commerce, but were commonized in medieval Europe. Like the ownership of land passed from a lord to his heirs, and trading in real estate was rare. And next is guild or union of artisans. So the guild system is the center of industrial production was also stepped in the tradition. Like a man become a carpenter or a glassblower, that is because it's the work of his father. And then the next is the master elected their own guild government and set their own work rules. Like they set the wage rates, output standard, and working condition. In short, the guilds were concerned with both the economic and non-economic dimension of life. And then the guilds of the Middle Age wanted to preserve an orderly way of life. So they regulated behavior at work and in the community. And then the idea was to maintain one's position in life rather than to enhance it. So that there was not a clear-cut distinction between one's social and economic life. Okay, next is the rise of industrial society. That is the steam engine could mark the beginning of the industrial revolution and the decline of the guilds. It allowed for the beginning of the factory system. And as opposed to the cottage industries that where the people work at home. And the steam engine freed people as a source of energy. That is enabled an energy source to be established anywhere because it used inanimate energy and could be moved. And then the factory used large number of workers who operate machine driven by the inanimate power. Each worker had his or her specific role to play in the manufacturing process. Next is the factory relied on the availability of the wage laborers, the free labor class unknown in the medieval Europe. And then next is the demand for wool led to the development of sheep farming, which resulted in the land being enclosed or fenced off for the grazing needs of the animal. This enclosure drove large number of serfs who previously worked the land of the estate into the cities. This movement created an improvised working class with nothing to sell but their labor. And then because of this, moreover, the enclosure movement changed the perception of land use. With the advent of an industrial society, the land became acceptable as an object of commerce. That is the representative of a new idea that land as a property could be owned. In the medieval Europe, the land was held but never owned. And then, thus, another major change was the development of a new middle class. That merchant now stood between the producer and consumer, and the rest of this entrepreneurial class was also necessary for the development of capitalism. Okay. Next is the capitalism versus feudalism. So for the capitalism and feudalism, the difference is like the capitalism was not traditional, but the feudalism is trusted in the tradition. The capitalism encouraged innovation while feudalism penalized innovation. And capitalism put a premium on planning and the rational use of technology, and feudalism put the economic activity was for the immediate satisfaction of wants. The capitalism did not stress equality, but in the feudalism, there was social equality. And then there's also the notion of social justice that was the basis of economic reward in medieval Europe. In capitalism, there was no such notion. Instead, there was the idea of free wages, that we pay the jobs, not the people. And then there was also the notion of a just price in feudalism. That is, capitalism substitute the competitive wages, that is the lowest wages that will maximize profit. And capitalism stresses compulsion on a duty to work hard. An important motive of capitalism was the duty to accumulate wealth. And then next is the Protestant ethic and the value of capitalism. So the Protestant ethic, Weber meant, is the driving force that compelled people, on the basis of service to God, to work hard and diligently, be frugal, save, and invest. The Protestant ethic contribute to the development of capitalism by providing the motivation toward work and entrepreneurship. And then, self-discipline was essential for the development of capitalism. The type of people needed for capitalism is the honest, sober, international, and rational. And then, this self-discipline needed inner cultural support, and it was important that it be extended to the working class. And the last is as capitalism become more formal and institutionalized, it depended less on religious motivation and looked to utilitarian and pecuniary motivation. For the next slide is about the perspective on the workers. For the Calvinists, viewed work as noble, but workers as lacking virtue. In early industrialists, espousing a philosophy of social Darwinism, it is believed that workers to be inferior because they were still struggling to survive. But in the early 90s, viewed workers as inherently lazy and interested only in economic rewards. In the 1920s, workers were viewed as a bundle of traits that could be understood through extensive testing. And in the human relation movement on the 1930s, the growing out of the work of Elton Mayo regarded workers as human beings but still treated them as a cost factor. Okay, next is for the next topic, it is about the assumption about human behavior. So assumption about human behavior, the first is both classical economists and classical management theorists assume that the primary goal of a business activity was profit maximization and that organization members were motivated primarily by economic factors. Thus, these theories assume that managers will engage in behavior that will maximize revenue and minimize costs. They further assume that work was essentially unpleasant and that people will avoid it whenever possible. And then the accounting system of that era were structured to help management maximize profit, that measure and control performance and rationally plan for the future. Thus, as the major provider of information to management, accountants will select the information they consider most useful to management. They will also decide how present the information and who will receive it. And then modern organizational theory propounds a different set of assumptions about the goals of business firm and the behavior of organization member. The objective of a firm based on the modern organizational theory are much more complex. And then the modern theorist sees work as possessing the potential for providing meaning and satisfaction in life. Okay, for the last slide is, in light of this set of assumptions, accounting is perceived as an information system that provides the appropriate relevant data to the various levels of management for their use in decision making. Further, for the first planning, control, and financial report to be of greatest use, the accounting system must be based on an awareness of the complexities of human behavior and an understanding of how people are likely to react to accounting information. The accountant who designed the system must be aware of the complex nature of organizational goals and of the social, psychological, and economic factors that affect human behavior. I think that's all from our group. Thank you very much for your attention.